All right, well, let's get started. So welcome everyone. Bienvenue, la plus cordiale bienvenue. My name is Erica Moorkerken. I'm the coordinator of the CanWatch Metrics Working Group and also a senior advisor for monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Also, a warm welcome and special thanks to colleagues with me here today, Marnie Davidson, Bart Dickinson, Benush Aranjani, and Jen Donville, colleagues from the Metrics Working Group and the Gender Equality Working Group. And they will present themselves in a little bit, but I wanted to acknowledge their presence, and we're going to have this conversation with you today and hope you enjoy it. I wanted to thank everyone for joining the CanWatch Academy, the 2023 edition. It's designed to provide a convenient, accessible learning platform for CanWatch members, colleagues, and peers. And the sessions we offer respond to the professional development and learning needs and interests that you have shared with us. So we're really pleased to provide this opportunity to support our members and partners in this way and look forward to a great week of learning with you. The week has started yesterday for sure. And today's session, just for your information, is also being delivered with the support and partnership of Global Affairs Canada. A brief moment also to acknowledge that I am joining today from Quebec City, which is Huron-Wendat territory. And we're all joining from such different places. So while we meet today on a virtual platform, I still would like to share my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples from all nations across Turtle Island and around the world. They are the traditional guardians of the land upon which we live and work, and I acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory. Now, before diving into this session, I would like to also share a few housekeeping notes with everyone. So for your information, simultaneous translation is available in English and French. Il y aura la traduction simultanée, so vraiment n'hésitez pas à l'utiliser. Please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen to select your language of preference. And also wanting to mention that you're invited to include next to your name on the chat here, EN or FR to indicate your preference. And that will be helpful for the breakout sessions, the breakout room that we'll be having a bit farther down the line in this conversation. If ever you have any questions, we don't have a Q&A per se, but if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or share in the chat. And also, if you have any technical difficulty, let us know, and we'll be in touch with Tina La Rochelle, whom I also would like to thank today, who is providing technical support. And a special thank you also to Maureen and Brian, who are providing simultaneous interpretation, and to Nicole Jamrozinski. We're a team here. This could not be possible without anyone. And Nicole, my colleague from CanWatch, who's also providing great support. So as we dive in here, I wanted to give you just a quick information. So we call this also a clinic. A clinic, not because we have sick indicators, but because it's a time to sit together and analyze and share some solutions to some concrete problems. And what kind of problems are those? Well, many of you have been involved in either developing a monitoring and evaluation plan or various aspects of the practice of M&E, whether you're a project manager or even a meal specialist or a gender equality specialist. And you've noticed, right, that this particular point in time, when you're choosing, defining, identifying, calculating your indicators, it's really a crucial moment in the meal process. And you've noticed also that the decisions you make at that time, they will have implications throughout the entire life of your project, of your program. And we also know that in this particular context, methodology is key. And so it's overall, what are we trying to do today? We're wanting to have a conversation to discuss this whole process of indicator selection or definition. And of course, we all share concerns. Are the indicators smart? Are they valid? Are they responsive to the local context? Have they been developed in collaboration with your local partners, et cetera, et cetera? And especially in health and rights programming, there are some interesting challenges. And overall, it's important to take a moment to look at this process. And for sure, there are a number of resources that you know of, that you use, but still, it's such a process that it's never finalized, and there's no perfect indicator, right? And so to carry out this conversation, I will first invite all of you, but especially Jen, Marnie, and Bart here, and briefly Benush as well, as she is joining us, to present themselves. Benush will be joining me as a co-moderator if needed during this session. But I have a question for each of them. There's one question that each will respond, and I'm inviting you all to answer this question as well in the group, as participants. And the easiest way for you to share your responses will be in the chat, and then we'll take a look at the chat and what you will be sharing with us. So I'll ask Marnie, Jen, and Bart to each present themselves, but also to answer this one question. So what is the one thing you remember when you select or define an indicator for a given outcome? We're diving right in, right? It's the meal stuff. But I'm asking you as well, right? Remember, you're also invited to share your answers to that question. And so over to you, Marnie, to maybe present yourself, and then over to Jen and Bart.
Hello, everyone. And my name is Marnie Davidson. I'm a senior health specialist at Global Affairs Canada in the Health and Nutrition Bureau. And I work mostly on monitoring, evaluation, and learning for our health investments. And it's such a pleasure to be here on a Tuesday morning to talk about indicators. Can't think of a better thing that I'd like to be doing. And so the one thing that I think about when working or developing or looking at indicators, I think is that they're evidence-based. And so that evidence can mean scientific literature and that they're validated indicators, or it could mean that they're developed in a participatory manner with rights holders, but that the indicator speaks to a body of gathering of evidence in terms of what you're looking at measuring. And I will hand it over to Jen.
Thanks, Marnie. Super, super exciting to be here with everyone and get into the nitty-gritty of indicators, which I think is one of the most interesting stages in terms of program design and monitoring evaluation. It really requires a lot of thought, and it's always really interesting. And my specialty is gender equality. I'm a member of the Gender Equality Working Group. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces joining us today. And the things that I remember, and I might wrap two into one and do a little cheat there. Three different teams will come up with three different indicator sets that resonate with them, right? So there is no one right indicator, right? There's just stronger or weaker indicators. And I wanted to say as well, from my perspective, bringing kind of the gender equality angle, that I think it's really important always when we're looking at indicators to check our assumptions about especially rights-based and gender-transformative programming, like working backwards to say kind of, am I assuming that there's a connection between this and this? Does this really indicate this change, right? Or is it an assumption that I'm making about the relationship between those things? Because often within that type of rights-based or gender-transformative programming, we see proxy indicators that aren't necessarily related to the change we're seeking when we're talking about power dynamics and transformative change. So always checking our assumptions. Over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name is Bart Dickinson. I am the Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation Coordinator for the Primates World Relief and Development Fund. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, good to see a lot of members from the metrics working group at CanWatch. I know Marnie is on that group, as well as a number of people on the call. So a real pleasure to have you all here. I think when I think about outcomes, I mean, my main focus with monitoring and evaluation is just about iterative testing and getting a lot of voices in the room. I think when we talk about indicators, we kind of often you find it happens within a bubble that you don't really have the appropriate time to have the necessary sort of consultative processes to ensure that an indicator is in fact relevant. And we're going to talk about SMART, but we often think about relevant in the context of a program, but is it relevant in the context of the stakeholders who we're engaging with and the people who we're intending to support and serve? And so I think in a lot of ways, we try to strive to find normative solutions and normative indicators, and so people will often Google what's the best indicator for X, and you'll find no examples for it. And I think that's because in a lot of ways, much of what is being done when measuring complex change, transformative change, is new. And so a lot of it is new, experimental, and creates space for that. So that aspect of learning is really fundamental to monitoring and evaluation, and really should be sort of streamlined through the entire process. And I will, I guess, pass it back to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Bart. And I think we'd like to also hear Benush on that question. Benush, over to you briefly, if you can let us know what do you have in mind when you're trying to identify those indicators?
Thanks. Sorry, let me just start my videos. Hi, everyone. I'm Behnush Aranjani, and I am the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist with Helpbridge Foundation of Canada. Very pleased to see you all here, and especially my colleagues with the Metrics Group. So that's a good question, and I think it's very, very difficult to answer that question. And I just want to add to what my colleagues said, that there is no right or wrong kind of indicator. And when it comes to selecting the indicators, I always think that these indicators are fluid. So maybe like down the line, when we just go into the projects, we may need to kind of adapt the indicators as we go by. Certainly, we'll look at the evidence and try to find what is meaningful. So start from the impact. What impact do we want to see, and what kind of indicators could reflect the changes that we want to see better from different lenses, from the community lens and from the founder lens and other groups. And so that's what I always think about when it comes to indicator. And I personally try to be very flexible with the indicators and don't stick to one indicator or a set of indicators, and to adapt them as we go by if we need to. So that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you so much, Benush, and thanks to all of you. I'm so lucky to be having this conversation with all of you. It feels like an extended gender equality metrics working group meeting with quite a few people here on the line with us. And just also forgot to mention that this session is also being recorded. So if you want to listen to it again at some point or share it with colleagues, please feel free to do so. It'll be available on the CanWatch website shortly. Now, before diving into two examples and sort of sharing perspectives on them, let's hear Marnie on a few maybe basics and reminders of important considerations when we're at that stage of defining indicators. And for sure, we're looking at indicators, especially for outcomes and especially for health and rights programming, but some of this applies to many areas.
So we thought, before we get into the more clinic part of the session and sort of unpacking the complexities around indicators, starting out with sort of the simple guidance on what it looks like to create and develop a good indicator. And I'm assuming most or all of us are very familiar with SMART indicators, and we have a good sense of what that means. But then in the process of, as we develop the indicators and as we have these conversations, as we look at how and what we're going to measure, sometimes we lose a little bit of the smartness of the indicator. And the examples that we have moving forward, I think, really unpack the complexity and around sort of the complex concepts that we want to be measuring, like women's empowerment or youth friendliness or access. But then bringing it back to what really is a smart indicator. And not all indicators are going to be absolutely 100% smart indicators meeting all the criteria, but at least if we understand where sort of additional complexity has been added into our indicators, we can better explain what it is we're measuring and how we're using that indicator. So indicators have to be specific. Is there only one idea in the indicator? As soon as we start to have an indicator that's measuring multiple ideas, it starts to become a little less and less clear what the value is that we get from that indicator. And we'll see some examples as we move forward. Is the equipment and/or expertise needed to track the indicator relatively available? So if we develop complex indicators that require teams of statisticians to develop indexes and statistical validity for, and then you tell me that 42% of women believe this, what does that really mean if it really requires a great deal of technical skill to be able to create that indicator? Similarly, it might require that same kind of technical skill to analyze, interpret it. And then it goes to, then is it really understandable for all the stakeholders that we are working with? So in a feminist context, making sure that those indicators that we create are really measuring something that we can clearly talk about with the people whom we're delivering services or programs to. And does it make sense to them when we say, well, 42% of you thought that X? Can we communicate that in a clear and simple way? So that's sort of the sort of specific dimension. And then, is it relevant? Does it really measure the outcome statement? And I think that's where, again, we need to challenge ourselves that we're not putting too much of the wording of the outcome statement in the indicator, and that we're really developing an indicator of that outcome statement. Is it time bound? Is it achievable? And then I'm going to sort of land on, is it measurable? Are we using measures in the indicator, or are we just sort of putting the language of the outcome statement in the indicator and then hoping that we can figure out a way to calculate it? So making sure that it's measurable, that the indicator language is a unit of measure and it's clear in that indicator what's being measured. And so I think as we work through our examples and we have our discussions, grounding ourselves in sort of the SMART methodology in developing indicators, but not being overly bound to it. And so that I think Jen mentioned that there's a lot of different ways to measure an outcome statement. And so making sure that the indicator makes sense, it's grounded in SMART methodologies, but then it makes sense and reflects the needs of the program and the people who are receiving the services. So that's just a sort of stage setting, and I'll end it there and see if Jen or Bart want to add.
Thank you so much, Marnie. I guess in terms of stage setting, we'll continue. This is really, as we say in French, setting the table, and things that sometimes, you're right, we tend to kind of forget when we're diving into this process within also very tight timeframes, and also with quite a few stakeholders involved. I always feel indicators are, you can't separate them from the outcome, but they're also the result of such a compromise. So perhaps one thing the next thing we'd like to do before having you all pitch in, dear participants, will be to take a look at some real life examples, some that you're probably all very familiar with. You've seen some of these before. So there's real life examples, and with their outcome. And Marnie and Jen and Bart will share their perspective on each of these. There are two examples, and then the third example will be over to you in breakout rooms. So let's start with the first example we have here. First example, you've probably seen something like this before: improved gender and adolescent responsiveness of sexual and reproductive health services at community health centers in a given community. So of course, as any outcome, there are several indicators. Here we have in this example, I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's an example, a percentage of community health clinics providing gender responsive SRH services in a community, and the number of adolescent girls accessing these services at community health centers. Et nous avons aussi donc la traduction ici. So maybe let's have you start, how can I say this? Start the ball, Jen.
Sure. So I'll just get us started with some reflections on this example and then pass over to Marnie and Bart to input too. We thought this was a really strong example because it is something that comes up so frequently in health programming, and it's tricky. It can be tricky. So I just want to point out and highlight a couple of things that Marnie said. One is to note that in our outcome, we have two elements that are being measured here, not just one. And so it's really important to understand that adolescent responsiveness and gender responsiveness aren't necessarily the same thing, right? So we need to take that into consideration, and it's in the language of the outcome, and we need to understand that those are two different qualities in service provision. And so your indicators need to reflect that distinction, right? And then the second thing too, just to highlight, is that we're not just talking about service provision in terms of the services provided by healthcare professionals. We're talking about services at the center itself. And so there are a couple of different ways that we can include that and reflect that. But the first indicator, I'll start with the first indicator. One of the things that just to highlight first off is, Marnie's point to just not repeat the language in your outcome in your indicator, right? So percentage of community health clinics providing gender responsive sexual reproductive health services in community X doesn't really tell us much of a story, but it does beg a lot of questions, like, how do you know that the services are gender responsive? And while you could kind of create an index or you could create a definition, et cetera, your indicator isn't really specific here. And what you could achieve with this, I think, is more specificity with a couple of different indicators. Like, so for example, when I look at this, I could say, well, what if I separate that out into service provision by healthcare providers and infrastructure, right? And then I have the adolescent friendly and gender responsive as well. So that when you're looking down your indicators, there's a clear story emerging, right? So you're looking at kind of, are there adolescent spaces? Is there a separate space waiting room for men and women? Is there, and you can include all of these elements in your measurement tools, but the specificity in your indicators starts to tell a story, right? And it explains how you're thinking about capturing and indicating success in this outcome area and progress in this outcome area. So I would say that. I would also say that I would caution everyone about using access as an indicator of improvement of service quality. It is not. It is not an indicator. We might want to see it, right? But we might not see it over the course of the program, and that doesn't mean that service quality has not improved. So really caution, this is what I would call one of those ineffective proxy indicators, right? Another example, just to take it outside of health, another example would be that increased income is an indicator of economic empowerment, which of course it isn't. Access does not necessarily indicate improved quality. We might be interested in knowing it, but it's important to understand that it doesn't necessarily indicate gender responsiveness or adolescent friendliness. And I'll leave my reflections there. Marnie, who wants to jump in? I know you've got lots to say about this example.
Yeah, and I won't. It's so interesting how like Jen, that's where Jen starts, and I start with, how are they, like, what's the data source on that? So the first one, I think I can kind of get a sense of. I expect it's some sort of quality of care tool that's being used that might do, as Jen suggests, like A section of that quality of care tool might measure infrastructure. A section of that quality of care tool might do some observation of clinicians. A section might look at supplies. But this isn't telling me what dimensions of gender responsiveness is being measured. So my point to this one is gender responsiveness isn't the measure, or access isn't the measure. Accessibility, affordability, quality, can't remember the fourth one, are all dimensions of a right to health. They're not the measure itself. And so my example here is like, if I'm looking to improve my distance in 2 hours of cycling, my measure isn't going to be the level of quality of distance on a scale of 1 to 10. It's going to be in kilometers, let's say. So making so not necessarily reflecting the language in the indicator, making sure it has a unit of measure. Level of distance, I'm at a 2 quality level of distance. I want to be at a 5 quality level of distance. That doesn't mean anything to you. But if I say last weekend I cycled 20 kilometers in 2 hours, and this weekend I cycled 40 kilometers in 2 hours, that then means something to you. So making sure again that indicator is telling a story. I will hand it over to Bart.
And it's interesting. Every different person looking at a different indicator comes up with the first preliminary question. To me, it's being very clear about what your definition of gender responsiveness is. And this is just not a simple indicator. There are so many measures to what make gender responsive SRH services functional, essentially at a clinical level. How are you weighing those? An indicator. I think a lot of times we tend to see that replication of language from indicator to outcome because of a limitation in space, because you don't actually have the capacity to use 15 indicators to measure something super complex. So it's like, oh, let's just bundle them all together. And then it becomes a question of are we working with an index, and then how do we weigh that index? For me, in M&E work is all about showing your work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with any particular definition as long as you can explain how you're unpacking it, how you're defining that indicator. But you get into the weeds if it becomes overly complex and you can't actually explain the relevance of that indicator or that result to whether it's who you're reporting to, or more importantly, I think the stakeholders you're engaging in the communities that you're working in. So when I look at this indicator, and the associated outcome statement, as Jen pointed out, there's a bit of a disconnect here because we're talking about gender responsiveness. We're not integrating that adolescent responsiveness thing in here, but one would think in a full sort of PMF format you would have more indicators complementing this. So it's also important to look at all of these things as not in a vacuum, but also understanding sort of there are spatial limitations to what you can do, and that you can get into the weeds with over complicating things, I think, because of that limitation. It's really important to sort of have a clear sense of what the value chain is when looking at facilitating this kind of change in language.
I just want to add one more thought before we move on too. And I would love participants to consider what's missing here, right? What's not being measured in this brief indicator set. And to me, it's a big elephant in the room, right? And if we're taking a rights-based approach to our programming, what's not missing here is the user's perspective, which is the most important. Who's going to know better than anything whether services are responding to the needs of users? Users will know. So there's no indicator here that's capturing the person at the center of the whole purpose of this outcome, which is the user. And presumably, if we're looking at adolescent girls and adolescent boys, and their comfort level and the confidence with the services being provided. So there might be an indicator around level of satisfaction. And again, when we're looking at that access, one of the things to consider very quickly is the intent to access too. Because when we're looking at measuring in short time periods, we might not see changes in access, but what we might want to do is get the perspective from the broader community of adolescents and say, would you feel comfortable? What's the reputation of the services? Will you go and use them? Do you understand how to access them, et cetera? Because that's a big part of intent to use, and that can tell a story too. So how can we use that data down the line? Always be thinking of how can I learn from that data, right?
Well, thank you so much. It's always so enriching to hear you all, and I think this resonates with quite a few. At least I hope so. These reflections, and I mean, when we were preparing this, we thought we could just go on for days talking about this, and anyone whose bread and butter this is for every day knows how easy it can be to sort of extend, your time on this. But we will take a close look also, but shorter, on the next example, which is another aspect that's pretty hard to measure, around agency. So if we have increased agency of women and adolescent girls to make choices about reproductive health and nutrition, that's a really tough one, right? So here, the two indicators that had been selected for this example were the level of confidence of adolescent girls to overcome barriers they are facing when seeking nutrition and reproductive health services. Un niveau de confiance. This one was originally shared actually in French. And then le deuxième indicateur, donc le pourcentage ou bien le nombre total de femmes et d'adolescentes qui ont déclaré avoir un pouvoir décisionnel lié à la santé reproductive, aux pratiques nutritionnelles et aux décisions économiques, ventilées par groupe d'âge et par région. Quite demanding, I would say, to properly answer that. So this time around, maybe Marnie, you could start the ball and then pass it on to Bart and Jen, and we'll stay as brief as we can on this one, so that then this third example will be over to the breakout groups. Thank you.
So I think this speaks a little bit to Anna's point. We want indicators to tell a story, but when we try to have indicators tell the whole story, we kind of maybe get a little bit lost in actually creating a measure. And I would say two things to that. One, if I'm looking at both these indicators, the first thing I'm doing is I'm going back to the theory of change and looking at their gender-based analysis to unpack what is meant by overcoming barriers and which nutrition services and which reproductive health services. Because this to me is not a measure. This is almost a description of the things that they're doing in the project. What I want to see is, and what this isn't telling me, is that a good contextual gender-based analysis has maybe not been done or not articulated in this indicator, and that they haven't identified the specific barriers. And then secondly, barriers to nutrition services for adolescent girls are going to be very different than barriers to reproductive health services for adolescent girls. So when we're combining them into a single value, is that really a relevant indicator? And I would say, is it really measurable? Even if we can come up with the number, 42% of adolescent girls are 4 out of 5 confident that they can seek nutrition or reproductive health services. That doesn't really tell me much. So I said this earlier to Erica, your indicator doesn't do your laundry. Like, it can only do one thing, and it has to be supported by a theory of change. An indicator works in a monitoring and evaluation ecosystem. So to Jen's point, we're not measuring we look at the outcome statement. We want to make sure that everything in that outcome statement is measured, but the indicator is going to only measure a portion of that. And you need to, okay, I've got the okay from Jen. You need to make sure that you've thought through the ways in which that whole outcome statement is going to be measured. And then I would say similarly for that second indicator, again, percentage of women and adolescent girls who declared having decision-making power over reproductive health, nutrition, and/or economic decisions. I mean, domains of empowerment are like production, resources, income, leadership, time, participation. Are you adding them all into one index? Have you unpacked those specific dimensions in your gender-based analysis? And so those are the questions I would ask. And then I would go to my gender specialist and work with them to try to unpack those from the gender perspective so that we can think through what specific indicators would look like. So then I do my consult to Jen. So I'll pass it over to Jen.
Yeah, Marnie, two things I want to just jump on with Marnie's thing. So, you know, I'm sure everybody's been in this position where data comes back and you realize that the way you phrase the indicator tells you nothing useful. Like, for example, a question about, you know, are boys and girls treated equally in the classroom? And you just get no across the board. 90% of people say no. Well, what you do with that data, you don't know how. You don't know how they're being treated unequally. You don't know who's being treated better than the other. There's nothing you can do to use that information to strengthen your programming. So exactly what Marnie said, it's like, you know, if you just have a number that's, 45% feel confident to overcome, and more importantly, if you have 20% feel confident to overcome barriers they're facing when seeking nutrition or reproductive health services. Well, that's bad, but you have no idea why it's bad or how it's bad. It's not telling you a story at all about which barriers they can't overcome, and are they barriers related to nutrition, or are they barriers related to, so the specificity of your indicator is to serve you and your program. And then the second thing that I wanted to say too is that this question of agency and empowerment, it is complex, and you will need multiple elements within one data collection tool, right? And so you are going to see in your indicator, terms like decision-making power, agency, et cetera, right? But it has to be very clear, as Marnie rightly said, it has to be very clear how you're defining that and understanding that, right? And it might not be explicitly detailed all in your indicator language, but it has to be clear how you're understanding decision-making power, right? And you have to be ready to demonstrate that, right? And that's really important, but it's not going to be as simple as saying like, how the percentage of girls who say they can make decisions in their household. It just doesn't work. Like that's not gonna be sufficient, right? And the third thing I would say with this example is that there is an element here that can tell you a really important part of this story that's not included, and that's the enabling environment for agency, right? So agency is not only us acting as agents, but it's also the space within which we articulate our agency, right? So an important element that could be included here is that enabling environment for agency too. Bart, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, looking at just the outcome statement and the indicators associated with this is just like donor-driven language. Like what you're coming out with at the end of this is something to feed back to someone who gave you money, and you're trying to meet the specific language requirements of that. This is kind of going to the quantifying quantifying qualitative feedback, I think. And Anna, your point is well taken. That I think when you're measuring things as complex as agency and self-determination and decision making, you really need to get at use a qualitative suite of indicators to get the full story, stories of significant change, focus group dialogues, interviews. You're going to get more nuanced and important information on agency from qualitative data sets, but this shows, that impetus again to quantify something that at the end of the day, the number that you get from this is not particularly relevant. And I would just say a shout out to the declared having decision-making power. Like there is a difference between perception-based indicators and are you actually seeing an improvement in decision-making, right? So do you feel like you have an improvement in knowledge, and do you have an improvement in knowledge, are completely different questions, right? And both are very relevant. But one is not a proxy for the other. And so it's important to kind of fundamentally understand the level of confidence, yes, that people have in asserting that they have decision-making power, but then exploring, again, sort of the external environment that Jen, I think, alluded to, that sort of contributes to creating that agency. And it's very contextually specific, culturally specific. So it's, you can talk about this indicator and this outcome statement forever. It is so complex, and I think that's kind of partly what we're going for in this conversation, to say that there are so many questions to ask when you look at this kind of language. And I think one of the key takeaways from this session is that maybe you don't come away with more answers, but you come away with a desire to ask more questions, I think is ultimately what this whole process is about.
And I would say to both Bart and Jen's point, that idea of enabling environment, just coming up with indicators of agency is really hard. It's very hard. If you start with some sort of women's empowerment theory of change for your project, that that's sort of one of the pieces of guidance in the women's empowerment note that was created by CanWatch, is that then helps you, gives you a frame of reference for what you can be measuring with your indicators. And to what Jen and Bart said, that actually helps you ask the question of what's missing.
So important that like we can't define what empowerment and agency looks like or how it appears or how it indicates, right, in different communities. This is where that co-creation, and this is where like having that collaborative, really deep understanding of what it is that you're looking at, how you're measuring it, et cetera, is so important, especially when it comes to things like empowerment and agency.
Thank you so much. And for sure, diving into the complexities, not wanting to be discouraged either. And it's just about, asking the right questions. And it's also a bit more of the process of asking those questions with the right people at crucial times to make sure that what you're measuring fully reflects the impact you're aiming at, right? And so these are two examples. There would be many. We were debating about having an example around outcomes that have to do with advocacy and the promotion of rights, because we know those can be tricky as well. But with the short duration of this session and wanting to also have an opportunity to engage everyone, now it'll be your turn. We'll go over to the next example. Third and final example. So we'll be dividing this into breakout groups. I think we can have 3. Is that right? Given the number of participants here, we'll have 3 groups. And you're invited to have a rapporteur in each group. And then take a moment to discuss the indicators that will be shared with the outcome, that will be shared. Discuss them a little bit, like we did with Bart, Marnie, and Jen. Look at, think of the different considerations that are important to keep in mind, and think of your recommendations that you would have for maybe different or adjusted indicators. And while initially we were thinking of maybe 20 minutes for this, let's keep it to 15 minutes so we have more time for discussion after. We're running a tiny little bit behind. Et aussi, donc dans les 3 groupes, il y aura un groupe francophone. Je me joindrai à vous. So we'll be back in about 20 minutes. For the rest of the groups will be sort of randomly assigned. So you'll, I hope you enjoy the conversation, and see you in a short while. Welcome back. So nice to see everyone as well. And I hope you had an exciting conversation, even if it was short. 15 minutes may seem short. There were 7 of us in the Francophones, and Farah will be the rapporteur. Who else will be sharing from the 2 other groups?
We neglected to select a rapporteur because we just dove right into the conversation, but I will ask for someone from our group if we could go second or third to message and volunteer in the chat, because you're all so brilliant and active.
Yeah, we also failed to identify a rapporteur, and then our conversation kind of derailed and covered a completely different area of subject matter, but an incredibly relevant and important aspect of conversation to have, I think.
I can definitely summarize, but Janine, thank you, Janine. Excellent. Okay, we have a rapporteur.
Parfait, wonderful.
Would anyone like to be a rapporteur on our end? Or does it have to be me?
Well, while you figure it out, maybe Janine can get started, and then Farah, and then whoever from your group, Bart. Is that all right?
Great. Thanks, Janine. Do
Okay.
you want to start us off with some reflections?
Sure. So I'm just going to read from the notes I took. So they might not be exactly grammatically correct, but because I was typing as we spoke. So
And
just
sorry,
hang on
Janine,
here.
can you remind us who are you with?
Group 3, Jen's group.
But I mean, which organization?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, my mind is just not there. I'm with the Primates World Relief and
Oh,
Development
right.
Fund. I'm a colleague of Bart's.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Okay, so we looked at the outcome language, and the outcome is more focused on CHWs and how they've been trained, but the indicators reflect more on the rights holders. How are we measuring that? The training did work, and we are seeing the improvements in health service delivery. What does improved look like? And just reinforcing, take the time to read every word in your outcome statement. The second indicator is too busy. It doesn't speak to the nature of the services being provided, lumping together women and girls who are facing different issues to access. Percentage of overall communities can still disaggregate this in overall improvement, but may not be measuring the aggregate of women and girls. There could be improvement or decline in women and girls access. If you're looking at the whole community, that might not be captured.
Janine, I'm just gonna pause and explain that one because I think it's a really interesting one. So one of our participants pointed out the percentage of women and girls in number 2 is grouped together. And one of the issues that we had with that is that allows you to aggregate the improvement in your indicator. And it doesn't mean that you're committing and developing a target for improvements in both women and girls, right? This is not a good indicator for this outcome anyways, but what are the implications when you group them together in an indicator? Is that in this indicator, you could see a big, huge improvement in women and no improvement of girls and still see an overall improvement, right? And hopefully you're digging around and telling that story within your analysis, but it's really important to identify exactly who you want to see improvements for in your indicators and be really specific about that, because that'll end up being what you're accountable for in the end, right? When you set your targets. So that was I thought that was a really insightful point from our group. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Janine.
So the first indicator should be measuring gender responsiveness, not the usage. And specificity and going back to gender analysis. Direction of change is improved. So yeah, it's assuming that if there is an improvement, something was already being done beforehand. What would improvement look like? And if there was no service or whatever it's trying to measure, increased would be better in language because it implies you're beginning from 0. Specificity and going back to the gender analysis, direction of change. Sorry if I'm repeating myself. Yeah, none of the indicators address the direction of change. Yeah, so I think that's kind of what we captured in our group.
Thank you so much, Janine. And this is,
Thanks,
I know,
Janine.
challenging to keep things short. Thank you so much to your group. Very rich conversation. And yeah, we have about a bit less than 10 minutes left. So trying to give a chance to everyone to speak. So Farah, peut-être tu pourrais aussi partager un petit peu les considérations, les remarques, conclusions du groupe francophone.
Oui, I'm gonna speak in French, so everyone, if you can just switch the channel. Donc, dans notre groupe, nous, on a parlé d'une inadéquation en fait entre le résultat et les indicateurs, étant donné que le résultat a l'air de se concentrer un petit peu plus sur la qualité de l'offre, quand aux indicateurs veulent souligner la quantité des services offerts. On a également abordé le fait qu'il y avait un manque cruel d'indicateurs qualitatifs et donc ça serait plus intéressant d'avoir une meilleure compréhension de la prise en compte du genre à travers des indicateurs qualitatifs pour décrire la perspective des usagères plutôt que le quantique qu'on peut lire ici. Il a été également souligné le fait de le besoin de diviser les services de santé sexuelle et de santé reproductive parce que la santé sexuelle et reproductive est un grand chapeau où il y a beaucoup d'éléments. On parle de dépistage d'infections sexuellement transmissibles et par voie sanguine, de planification familiale, de soins pré- et post-avortement. Et donc, ça serait intéressant en fait de voir, dépendamment aussi des contextes, si on a une amélioration de l'utilisation des services en santé sexuelle, en santé reproductive ou les deux à la fois. Donc, c'est ça. On a également parlé de mesurer la perception des agents de santé communautaire à travers focus group ou des entrevues semi-dirigées. Et donc, c'est ça. Et puis, le troisième indicateur, on a parlé du fait que le nombre de services prenant en compte le genre ne raconte pas vraiment d'histoire. Comment le gender responsiveness est pris en compte. Donc, voilà, j'ai essayé de résumer le gros de notre conversation.
Un grand merci, Farah. Donc, Farah avec Oxfam Québec. Et je vois que Annie est d'accord avec tout ce que tu as dit. Est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre dans le groupe aurait un petit ajout? C'est bon? Je ne voudrais pas bousculer tout le monde et je pense qu'on s'amuse bien, mais on n'a plus assez de temps. So over to you, Bart. Have you found your rapporteur? We can't hear you.
Sorry, for some reason, all of my commands have disappeared from the bottom of my screen. So I just learned how to press Alt-A to turn my microphone on. Oh, there they are. Okay, well, it looks like I'll be reporting back for our group. And really our conversation immediately kind of took a pivot to sort of reflect on speaking more about the complexity of language. And I think from our previous conversations, when we looked at our first two examples, it might be implied that we were suggesting that people be using more indicators for measuring change. And I don't think we're advocating for more or overcomplicating the process or asking for more indicators. But what we're trying to say earlier is that measuring complex change where you often have a limited space or a number of indicators to work with. When you're dealing with a degree of complexity in language and result statements in order to meet certain parameters or to be a GE3 project, it necessitates a complex response or a complex evaluation. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be an incredible sort of an incredibly complex index, essentially, at the end of the day. What is really important with monitoring and evaluation, to me, it's, we had this comment that your indicators won't do your laundry. Like, we think that the obligation to use complex results language necessitates significantly complex indicator statements. I think if you provide if you think out your process, if you show your work, if you develop a thorough monitoring and evaluation plan and a methodology that explains why you're using certain indicators to achieve or to define a certain type of result, that you can still do justice to a complex change with a simple set of indicators. I think when you're overcomplicating language too, you have to understand, who's the end user of that information and how are they going to be able to process and use that information themselves. If that information or those results or those indicators aren't really relevant to the people that you're intending to serve, then is that indicator really relevant or useful in the context of the program that you're working in? So I think that's why, just to reiterate, your M&E plan is so very important, explaining your rationale, unpacking your reasoning, and why is any given indicator an appropriate measurement of agency or change, significant change. and creating space for, again, more qualitative assessment. I think we're kind of limited to one quantitative and one qualitative indicator in a lot of ways. And so we think about trying to, I think, overburden those indicator definitions while ultimately losing track of what the end goal is. I would invite anyone from my group, Benush, Marnie, if there's any sort of additional points. Maybe it wasn't germane to what you see on the slide here. That output indicator is, we were talking about it, it's not an output. That was my one kind of comment there. But beyond that, yeah, from my group, was there any sort of important piece of feedback to relay?
I'll also kind of, and Anna, please jump in if I'm sort of misrepresenting this, but I do think that, a real challenge was brought up in that there's a lot of demands on these indicators to do a lot of things. And trying to meet all those needs and make the indicator meaningful can seem like a little bit of a losing battle. And I think just to recognize that this is not easy work, and it's not easy work, not necessarily because we can't find good measures, but these are people processes. And an indicator represents a whole process that you've gone through and a lot of work and energy that you put into doing this. So it's not an answer, but more of a recognition that this is, it is challenging work, and it's, and we all feel very passionately about making sure that what we're doing is representing our work well. And that's not always easy to balance all the different interests.
Thank you so much, Marnie, and that definitely resonates I'm hoping for anyone who's been involved in this kind of process. And it's about finding common ground also in a shared language to talk about a similar how change is happening. And I see we have just about 1 minute left to this session, unfortunately, and I just wanted to give a great thank you to everyone. Un grand merci à tout le monde pour votre participation, for your inputs, especially to Bart, Marnie, Jen, and Benush for the preparation and the rich conversations leading up to this session today, and everyone for joining. This will be recorded, as I think we've mentioned, and will be available on the CanWatch website shortly. And we'll see if we can even put something together in writing to it's not the truth, but it's some interesting considerations to bear in mind when you're doing this important work of finding the right measures. Un grand merci à tout le monde, and à très bientôt.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks to the interpreters, to Tina, to Nicole, to everyone who joined today again. À bientôt.